The sunset bled across the desert sky like a bruise, deep purple swallowing gold. Ellie Mason knelt beside her battered truck, a wrench slipping from her fingers as smoke hissed out from under the hood. She wiped grit from her cheek, cursing softly under her breath. 10 miles from anywhere, dead phone, no spare water. She was stranded, plain and simple. Then through the swirling dust came the sound of hooves. A dark figure emerged, part myth, part man. He rode a black horse like he belonged to another century, hat pulled low, denim worn thin by the sun. He reined in, voice low and rough. "You look like you could use a miracle, or a mechanic." Ellie narrowed her eyes. Strangers out here didn't usually mean rescue, but something about him, steady, unhurried, made her grip the wrench tighter. And hope. And so began the longest night of her life. Ellie rose slowly from the gravel, jaw set. "Depends which you're offering," she called back. The stranger tilted his head, easy, patient. "Left my miracle kit in the last ghost town," he said. "But I can turn a wrench." The wind kicked up dirt between them as he dismounted, boots crunching. He didn't swagger like the roughneck she knew. He moved like someone who'd walked 1,000 hard miles and had no reason to brag about surviving any of them. Ellie hesitated. Her instincts were screaming not to trust, but 10 miles on foot with coyotes howling in the distance wasn't a better bet. She stepped back, nodding once. He approached the truck, lifting the hood like he'd done it 100 times before. Ellie studied him. Rough hands, sleeves rolled, dust caked into the seams of his shirt, face shadowed by his hat. His presence wasn't loud. It was anchored, solid, the way fence posts withstand years of storms. "You got a name?" she asked, arms folded. "Robert," he said, not looking up. "Just Robert." A corner of his mouth twitched. "That's all the name I need tonight." After a few minutes, he straightened, wiping grease onto his jeans. "Radiator's shot. She's not driving anywhere till she's towed." Ellie sighed, the weight of the day pressing harder. "Got a ranch about 10 miles west. Trailer. Spare truck." She met his eyes. "You help me get there. I'll pay you in a hot meal and a place to sleep." He gave a slow nod, the kind a man gives when he's used to deals made on trust alone. Deal. It took longer than she liked to strap her gear to his saddle. When he swung onto the horse, he offered his hand without a word. Ellie hesitated only a breath before grabbing it and climbing up behind him. The night swallowed them whole as they rode west, the desert singing low and lonely. Ellie gripped the saddle, conscious of his steady breathing in front of her. The warmth of another human being in a world that had felt cold too long. When the ranch lights finally flickered in the distance, she felt something she hadn't in months. Relief. And the smallest, most dangerous thing of all, hope. The old wooden sign creaked in the wind as they passed it. Silver Hollow Ranch, established Nitin Sitini. Ellie slid off the horse, boots hitting the gravel with a muted thud. She moved stiffly, every muscle aching from the ride, but Robert dismounted as if he'd stepped off a city curb. He took her busted gear from the saddle without being asked, like he knew pride was something she held tighter than a handshake. "You any good with tools?" she asked, voice cautious as they reached the barn. "Depends on the tools," Robert answered, tying the horse with practiced ease. "Depends on the job." Ellie hesitated, hands stuffed into her jacket pockets. "Got a broken gate, leaky roof, too." She shrugged, pretending it didn't matter. "If you're looking for work, might have a bed and some wages for a few days." He looked at her then, really looked, not at her dirt-streaked face or worn jeans, but something underneath. "Few days," he said finally. "Then I move on." Ellie nodded even though something deep in her chest pulled tight. Later, she set a steaming bowl of venison stew in front of him, along with cornbread thick with butter. Robert removed his hat and murmured a quiet thank you before eating with slow, deliberate bites. He didn't gobble like a starving man. He ate like someone who hadn't shared a table in a long time. The silence stretched warm between them. "You ever settle anywhere?" Ellie asked, swirling her spoon in her bowl. Robert's gaze stayed on his plate. "Not in a long time," he said quietly. "Running from something?" His fork paused midair. "Running toward peace," he said simply. The honesty in it knocked the air from her lungs. Not slick, not rehearsed, just truth, raw and worn. Outside, the wind howled against the window panes, brushing the house with cold, searching fingers. Ellie wrapped her arms around herself and wondered when the world had started feeling like something she had to brace against. After dinner, she offered him the bunkhouse by the barn, an old building barely fit for mice. Robert accepted without fuss, no questions, no demands. When he stepped out into the night, Ellie locked the door behind him, the bolt clicking loudly in the silence. She stood there a long moment, one hand on the wood, heart hammering. Something about him didn't add up. He was too steady, too calm, too dangerous in the ways that didn't show until it mattered. But still, she found herself hoping against better judgment that he might stay longer than a few days. Outside, the night deepened, the stars cold and hard above Silver Hollow. Inside, Ellie finally let herself breathe. The first crash ripped through the night like a gunshot. Ellie bolted upright in bed, heart hammering against her ribs. For a moment, she thought she was dreaming. Then the second crash came, the desperate, terrified whinny of horses, followed by the unmistakable sound of splintering wood. She snatched the rifle from behind the door, shoved her bare feet into worn boots, and sprinted into the cold dark. The barn loomed ahead, one of its wide doors swinging wildly on broken hinges. Shapes moved inside, quick, furtive, shadows against shadows. Ellie raised the rifle, trembling, every instinct screaming to run, but before she could act, another shadow detached itself from the gloom, moving faster, sharper, like a storm breaking loose. Robert. He moved with brutal grace, grabbing one man by the jacket and hurling him into the barn wall with a sickening thud. Another attacker lunged at him with something gleaming in his hand. Ellie's mind barely registered it was a crowbar. Before Robert ducked, twisted, and slammed the man's wrist against a post. The weapon clattered to the ground. It wasn't luck, it wasn't drunken brawling. It was training. Precision. The third man, seeing the carnage, turned and ran into the night. By the time Ellie reached the barn, panting, rifle shaking in her hands, Robert was already calming the panicked horses with low, steady murmurs. Two men lay groaning in the dirt, and the scent of sweat, blood, and fear filled the air. "You okay?" Ellie gasped, voice hoarse. Robert glanced up, eyes clear and steady despite the chaos. "Better question for them," he said, nodding toward the men on the ground. She stared at him, heart pounding in a different rhythm now, not just from fear, but something else. Awe, confusion. "Who are you?" she whispered. Robert wiped blood from his knuckles onto his jeans, straightening slowly. "Just Robert," he said again. But this time, even he sounded like he didn't quite believe it anymore. The next morning, Silver Hollow Ranch felt different. Robert worked without a word, sleeves rolled, hammer steady. He patched the barn door before Ellie could even find her shoes. He reinforced the gate locks, checked the fences, replaced the stall chains, all before breakfast. Ellie sat on the porch steps, paperwork forgotten in her lap, just watching. She'd seen ranch hands fumble with the simplest tasks, lose their tempers over stubborn wood or balky horses. But Robert moved differently, quiet, efficient, like he was putting pieces of himself back together with every nail he drove. It wasn't just skill, it was memory. Muscle memory built long before he ever drifted into her life. Ellie waited until the last hinge was hung before she stood, heart in her throat. "Thanks," she said, voice rougher than she meant. "For last night?" Robert nodded once, wiping sweat from his brow. "You get much trouble out here?" he asked. Sometimes," she admitted. "Land like this." She glanced at the distant hills. "It draws vultures." Robert said nothing, but his jaw tightened as he stared out across the land as if he saw not just trouble coming, but remembered too well what trouble could do. The day turned hot and mean by noon, the kind of heat that made the dirt crack and the air shimmer. Ellie wiped the sweat from her brow as she hammered another loose fence rail into place. Robert worked a few yards down, focused, silent. Then came the sound of a truck, a low growling rumble tearing up the gravel road toward the ranch. Ellie stiffened instantly. She knew that engine. Robert caught her reaction and stood straighter, setting down his hammer with care. A gleaming black pickup slid to a halt at the gate. The driver stepped out, slamming the door with unnecessary force. Tall, polished boots, pressed jeans, a shirt with buttons that probably cost more than Ellie's truck, and a smile that had once charmed her and now made her skin crawl. Ray Easton. He walked toward them like he still owned every piece of ground he crossed, hands loose at his sides but eyes sharp and assessing. "Ellie," he called, flashing that politician's grin. "Heard you had some truck trouble. Thought I'd come lend a hand." "Too late," Ellie said, voice flat. She glanced at Robert without thinking, and that alone made Ray's smile tighten. Ray's gaze flicked to Robert, sizing him up. "Friend of yours?" he asked lightly, but his tone had an edge. Robert leaned against the fence post, arms folded loosely, hat pulled low. He didn't smile, didn't blink. He didn't need to. "Helps out around the ranch," Ellie said coolly. "That's all you need to know." Ray chuckled, the sound thin and brittle. "That's so? Figured after everything you might be ready to talk business." Ellie's stomach turned. "I told you, Ray, I'm not selling." He took a slow step closer, voice dropping. "You really think you can hold out forever? Land like this, it costs. Repairs, taxes, insurance. One little lawsuit and you'd fold like a cheap chair." Robert straightened, his shadow falling across the dust. "You threatening her?" His voice was low even, but it cracked through the air like a whip. Ray turned, feigning surprise. "Excuse me?" "You heard him," Ellie said, stepping between them. Her hands trembled slightly, but her voice didn't. "You're not welcome here, Ray." Ray's face darkened. He took another step forward, too close. Robert moved then, slow but deliberate, stepping down from the fence line and planting himself between Ellie and Ray. Not aggressive, not loud, just immovable. "You should leave," Robert said. For a second, Ray hesitated, measuring him. Then, with a tight smile that didn't touch his eyes, he backed up toward his truck. "You'll regret this, Ellie," he said over his shoulder. "You always do." The truck peeled away, throwing a rooster tail of dust into the air. Ellie stood frozen, every muscle strung tight until Robert touched her elbow gently. "You okay?" he asked. She swallowed hard, nodding once. "He's not gonna stop." Robert stared after the disappearing truck, jaw locked. "Then neither will I." The heat seemed to lift then just a little, but Ellie knew, deep down, the real storm was only just gathering. The night thickened early, the sky bruising purple behind the hills. Ellie double-checked the barn locks, the porch light, the old Winchester by the door. Robert worked in silence beside her, tying down the gates with fresh rope, hammering steel into the dirt until the air smelled like sweat and determination. Neither of them said it, but they both knew Ray wasn't finished. Around midnight, the sound came again. Engines. Multiple. Ellie jerked awake from a half-sleep at the window, grabbing the rifle. Robert was already moving across the yard, shotgun loose in one hand, the other reaching for the walkie-talkie. "Back door," he said, voice low and urgent. "Call the sheriff." "I'm not leaving you," she hissed, but Robert's look stopped her cold. Not anger, not command, pure need. "Then stay close," he said. They moved through the dark like shadows, the ranch bathed in moonlight. Headlights flared at the edge of the pasture. 3 trucks, engines idling low. Figures spilled out, flashlights sweeping the land like predators scenting blood. Ray's voice echoed across the open fields. "Come out, Robert. Let's not make this messy." Robert stepped into view, gun low but ready. Ellie trailed behind him, heart hammering against her ribs, breath sharp and painful. "You made your move," Robert called back. "Now back off." Ray sauntered forward, hands loose, smirk cold. "You think paperwork's gonna save you? You think a bunch of scared farmers and a few signatures mean anything?" "No," Robert said, voice cutting clean through the dust and tension. "But witnesses will." Somewhere beyond the hill, the faint wail of sirens carried on the wind, growing louder. Ray's jaw tightened. "You called the law?" Robert didn't flinch. Number Ellie did. At that, Ray lunged forward, rage breaking through his polished surface. One of his men rushed in from the side, crowbar raised. Robert moved without thinking, without hesitation. He ducked, grabbed the attacker by the arm and twisted hard. The crowbar clattered to the ground. Ellie, rifle steady despite the tremor in her hands, stepped into view. "Back away, Ray," she called, voice slicing through the chaos. Ray turned, snarling, but it was too late. A sharp crack split the night. One clean warning shot into the dirt at Ray's feet. He stumbled back, hands raised, fury radiating off him like heat. His men scattered, tires spinning as trucks reversed wildly out of the pasture. In the distance, red and blue lights tore through the night toward them. Ray dropped to his knees, hands behind his head, face twisted in hate. Robert lowered his gun, muscles still coiled tight. Ellie stood frozen, heart racing, blood roaring in her ears. "You okay?" she gasped. Robert turned toward her slowly, blood dripping from a shallow cut at his temple. He smiled grimly. "Close enough." Sheriff cruisers surrounded the ranch seconds later. Deputies spilled out, guns drawn, shouting orders. Ray was cuffed on the spot. Unregistered weapons, trespassing, conspiracy to intimidate. By dawn, the ranch was quiet again, save for the wind whispering through the broken gate. They'd won the first battle, but Ellie knew it was only the beginning. The sun bled slowly over Silver Hollow, painting the land in pale gold. But inside the ranch house, the weight of the night still pressed heavy. Robert sat at the kitchen table, stitches glinting at his temple, ribs bound tight beneath his shirt. He sipped black coffee like it was penance. Ellie hovered in the doorway, unsure how close was too close. Every instinct screamed to step back to keep the distance safe. But every memory of the night before pulled her forward. "You didn't even hesitate," she said finally, voice soft. Robert set the mug down. "Didn't need to." "You've done this before," she whispered. He didn't answer. Didn't need to. Silence filled the gaps where confession should have been. Ellie crossed the room, pulled out the chair across from him. "Why do you hide it?" she asked, fingers tracing the chipped tabletop. Robert exhaled slowly, as if dragging the words from somewhere buried deep. "Because the last time I fought for something," he said, eyes distant, "I lost more than I saved." The room went still, save for the clock ticking relentlessly on the wall. "And this time?" she asked, heart thudding painfully in her chest. He looked up then, really looked, and for the first time she saw it all. Not just the strength, not just the skill, but the sorrow, the crushing weight of old battles lost. "This time," he said quietly, "I'm still figuring it out." Ellie swallowed hard against the lump in her throat. She reached into the pocket of her flannel jacket and set something down on the table between them. The envelope, the one she'd found in the loft, heavy with names and deeds and signatures she hadn't wanted to believe. Robert D. Harrison. He didn't flinch at the sight of it, only nodded, slow and sad, like he'd been waiting for this reckoning. "You lied to me," Ellie said, voice trembling. "I didn't lie," Robert said, almost a whisper. "I just didn't tell. You let me think you were some broken-down cowboy looking for a place to sleep," she said, anger flashing bright and sudden. "Not a man who once owned half this damn state." Robert's jaw tensed. He leaned forward, voice steady. "I wasn't hiding from you, Ellie. I was hiding from the man I used to be." She wanted to yell, to slam the door, to protect the fragile pieces she'd barely begun to trust again. But something in his voice, something cracked and raw, held her still. "I don't care about the name," she said hoarsely. "I cared about who you were here." She tapped her chest near the aching place she hadn't dared name yet. "And I still am," he said, leaning closer. "With you." The sunlight slipped across the table, catching the raw edges of their hurt and hope alike. Ellie looked away, biting the inside of her cheek. "You said you were running toward peace." "I was," he said softly. "Then I found something better." Their eyes locked. No promises, no grand declarations, just the battered, stubborn beginnings of something real. Maybe peace wasn't a place, maybe it was a person. 3 days later, the old town meeting hall smelled like dust, sweat, and the last flickers of hope. Ellie stood by the door, heart hammering, as the room filled slowly. Farmers with worn boots and sun-scorched faces, ranchers with tired eyes, teachers with calloused hands. People who had built their lives in the cracks of the land, only to watch Ray Easton trying to rip it out from under them. At the front of the room, Robert adjusted the maps pinned to a battered easel. No tie, no suit, just rolled sleeves, worn jeans, and the weight of something bigger than himself resting on his broad shoulders. When he finally spoke, the room stilled. "My name's Robert Harrison," he said, voice low but cutting through the quiet like a blade. "Some of you might recognize that name, some might not." Doesn't matter. He looked at each face in turn, steady and unapologetic. What matters is this. Ray Easton isn't just making offers, he's squeezing you out. Quiet threats, shady contracts, legal tricks. I've seen it before. Different town, different faces, same damn greed. He held up a thick packet of papers, the legal filings for injunction. These documents buy us time. They freeze his development plans. They put a light on everything he's tried to bury in the dark. But I can't file them alone. I need you. The room shifted, low murmurs growing. An old rancher near the back, white-haired, stooped from years of wind and work, lifted his hand. You really Robert D. Harrison, the one who disappeared? Robert nodded once, no shame, no excuses. Yeah, I disappeared. When I lost everything that mattered, I ran. I won't run this time. Silence fell again, thick, expectant. Then a woman in a patched denim jacket stood up. Where do I sign? Another voice. Me too. One by one they came, signing their names onto the filings with pens that shook slightly. Not from fear, but from the weight of standing up for something bigger than themselves. When it was done, 25 names gleamed in blue ink. Enough to stall Ray's project. Enough to bring the fight into the open. Robert met Ellie's gaze across the room. She nodded, a tremor of something fierce and proud running through her chest. Maybe you couldn't save everything, but you could damn well try. Later that night, the barn felt too quiet, the stars overhead brittle and cold. Robert paced near the open stall doors, walkie-talkie clipped to his belt, shotgun leaning against the wall. Ellie approached quietly, her hands stuffed into her jacket pockets. You think Ray'll come again? She asked. Robert didn't look away from the pasture where shadows moved like ghosts in the wind. He has to, he said, because men like him can't afford to lose. Ellie swallowed. And us? Robert turned finally, eyes softer than she'd ever seen them. We can't afford to give up. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote yipped, a lonely, broken sound. Ellie stepped closer, feeling the world tilt slightly on its axis. Then we don't. Side by side, they watched the land they loved, knowing the next fight wouldn't be won in the shadows, but in the open, with every scar they carried. Together. The clock on the wall ticked past midnight. Ellie sat by the window, rifle propped against the sill, eyes burning from the strain of staying awake. Every creak of the old house, every snap of wind against the shutters made her heart jump. Somewhere outside, Robert moved along the fence line like a silent shadow, checking the locks, the gates, the weak spots. The world had gone still, the kind of stillness that only comes before a storm. Then headlights. 3 sets barreling fast down the gravel road, engines snarling like beasts. Ellie grabbed the rifle, heart hammering. They're here, she hissed into the walkie-talkie. Robert's voice crackled back, low and certain. Remember the plan. Stick to it. She pressed herself against the doorway, barely breathing, watching the truck skid to a stop near the barn. Doors slammed, men spilled out, hoods pulled up, weapons glinting under the moonlight. And at the center, walking like a man who thought the world owed him the earth and the sky, Ray Easton. Come on out, Harrison, Ray shouted, voice ragged with fury. You think a few signatures scare me? You think some ink on paper can stop what's coming? Robert stepped into the light. No gun drawn yet, no threats. Just a man standing between a predator and everything he loved. You made your choice, Robert said, voice cutting through the thick night air. Now live with it. Ray sneered. You think you're a hero? You're just a ghost wearing a dead man's name. Robert didn't flinch. Maybe, he said, but even ghosts can haunt a man like you. Ray roared and lifted a pistol. Before the shot rang out, Ellie moved, stepping from the shadows, rifle raised, breath steady. Drop it, Ray, she shouted. He turned toward her wild-eyed. One deafening shot cracked through the night, not from Ray's gun. Ellie fired a warning shot inches from his feet, dust exploding upward. The standoff shattered. Ray's men panicked, some charging, some running. Robert moved like a force of nature, disarming one thug with a brutal twist of the arm, decking another with a hard, sure punch that crumpled him into the dirt. Ellie covered him, picking off attackers with warning shots that herded them toward the rising howl of sirens from the town road. Sheriff Lang's cruisers burst onto the scene, red and blue lights slicing through the chaos. Deputies poured out, weapons drawn, voices barking orders. Within minutes it was over. Ray was on the ground, cuffed and cursing, blood dripping from his nose. His men were face down in the dirt, and Silver Hollow stood, battered but unbroken, behind Robert and Ellie like an old soldier refusing to fall. Robert staggered slightly, blood seeping through his bandaged ribs. Ellie was at his side in a heartbeat, steadying him. You all right? She asked, breathless. He managed a grim smile. Close enough. Sheriff Lang approached, nodding once at Robert before turning to Ellie. You press charges? She looked at Robert, at the land stretching behind him, at everything they had fought for, not just dirt and wood, but belonging and second chances and love forged in the fire. Damn right I am, she said fiercely. As the deputies loaded Ray into the back of a cruiser, Ellie wrapped her arms around Robert's waist, feeling the solid weight of him against her. They had stood their ground. They had fought back. And this time, they hadn't lost. Above them, the stars blinked awake, indifferent and endless. But for the first time in years, neither of them felt small. They were exactly where they were meant to be. The days after the attack unfolded slow and tender, like a song rebuilt from broken notes. Robert moved carefully now, every step betraying the bruises he refused to complain about. Ellie noticed the way he favored his left side when lifting hay, the way he winced when he thought she wasn't looking. She said nothing, just worked beside him, step for step, letting silence say what words couldn't. The ranch bore its scars too, the shattered gate, the rutted pasture, the dark stain of fear clinging to the old barn beams. But every morning before the sun even cleared the ridge, Robert was out there, hammering, sanding, rebuilding. Not just the ranch, himself. Ellie found him one evening by the corral brushing Dusty, their most skittish mare. His movements were slow, patient, a kind of prayer offered up in strokes of hand over trembling flank. You're gonna spoil her, Ellie teased softly, leaning against the fence post. She deserves it, Robert said without looking up. He ran his hand down the mare's neck, his voice rough with quiet reverence. We all do, once in a while. Ellie swallowed hard against the tightness rising in her chest. The sky behind him blazed in streaks of rose and gold, painting the land with a beauty so fierce it hurt. She stepped closer, boots scuffing the dusty ground. You ever think about what comes next? Robert didn't answer right away. He set the brush aside, wiped his hands on his jeans, and finally looked at her. Every day, he said. He turned his gaze to the horizon where the hills rolled out into forever. I used to think I was built for building things, he said. Deals, empires, things that looked good in the papers but meant nothing when the lights went out. He paused, swallowing hard. But lately, he trailed off, searching the hills like they might hold the answer. I just want to build something real, something that lasts, something true. Ellie's heart hammered so loudly she thought he might hear it. You have, she said. Robert reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small box, not velvet, not new, just simple, worn soft by years of waiting. He opened it, revealing a thin silver ring, delicate but strong, a single faint engraving inside the band. Ellie leaned closer, breath-catching. The inscription was in her mother's handwriting, the familiar looping letters from an old birthday card she had once left on the kitchen table long before the world got hard. Come home when you're ready. Robert didn't kneel. He didn't make a speech. He just held the box out, eyes steady, voice raw. I haven't loved in years, he said quietly. Didn't think I could. Not like this, not where it mattered. Ellie's hand shook as she reached for the ring. Tears blurred her vision, but she smiled anyway, wide and reckless and real. I don't need a church, Robert added. I don't need a crowd, I just need you. She slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, like it had been waiting there all along. I'm here, she whispered. And for the first time in a long, long time, the future didn't look like a battle to survive. It looked like a home they would build, brick by battered brick, hand in calloused hand. Together. Spring came early to Silver Hollow, coaxing wildflowers from the stubborn earth and turning the hills soft and green. The ranch buzzed with quiet life now. Not just the whinny of horses or the clatter of tack, but the kind of life that seeps into the bones of a place when people have chosen to love it fiercely enough to make it bloom again. Ellie stood on the front porch, a sleeping infant bundled snug against her chest in a woven wrap. She rocked gently, the rhythm natural, as she watched teenagers saddle up skittish mares under the careful eyes of 2 ranch volunteers. Her daughter, Wren Mason Harrison, shifted against her, tiny fingers curling into the fabric of Ellie's jacket. Across the pasture, Robert walked alongside a young boy guiding a patient old gelding with steady hands. His stride was slower these days, not from injury but from purpose. Like every step he took was one he intended to keep. The boy laughed at something Robert said, and Robert ruffled the kid's hair with a rough affection that twisted something sweet and painful in Ellie's chest. This was what they had built. Not an empire, not a monument, a home. After Ray's downfall, after the court battles and land seizures and long sleepless nights, they had rebuilt the ranch piece by piece, and with it they had rebuilt a town that had almost given up on itself. Silver Hollow was no longer just cattle and dust. It had become a place of second chances, a place for veterans who needed quiet to heal, a place for kids who had been given up on by too many, a place where broken hearts could find soft ground to mend. Robert never put his name on anything, didn't want to. He just showed up every day, at the crack of dawn, boots dusty, hands ready. Ellie tightened her arms around Wren and made her way down the porch steps, careful on the gravel. Robert saw her halfway across the pasture and smiled. That quiet, easy smile that still unraveled her like a thread pulled gently loose. "Morning, Mrs. Harrison," he called, voice warm. "You're late for breakfast, Mr. Harrison," she teased. He met her at the fence line, brushing a kiss across her forehead before peeking down at the sleeping baby. "Out cold," he murmured with a grin. "Like her old man after fence duty." Ellie laughed softly. Fair enough. They walked together toward the old wooden entrance to the ranch. The original sign her father had carved decades ago had been lovingly sanded, repainted, and recarved with a new name. Harrison Ridge, where we come back to life. Robert stared up at the sign for a long moment, sunlight crowning the tips of the hills behind it. "Think your dad would have liked it?" he asked quietly. Ellie nodded, throat tight. "He would have liked you." Robert's eyes softened, and he slipped his hand into hers. "Took me long enough to earn it," he said. "You earned it," she whispered back, "the moment you stayed." They stood there a while longer, the breeze tugging at their clothes, the land stretching wide and endless around them, the hum of life buzzing steady under the surface. They had lost much, but they had built more, not with power, not with money, but with hands steady from years of hurt, with hearts that refused to quit, with love that asked for nothing more than a chance to bloom where the world had once gone dry. As the sun rose higher over Harrison Ridge, Ellie turned to Robert, her heart swelling so full it hurt. "Let's ride," she whispered. He nodded, and together, with Wren tucked safe between them, they saddled 2 horses and rode slowly up the ridge trail. Up to the same hilltop where Robert had once stood alone, believing he'd never belong anywhere again. Now, as he looked down over the land spread out before them, he knew. He wasn't a ghost anymore. He was a husband, a father, a man who had come back to life exactly where he was meant to be. Because sometimes the strongest love stories aren't built from perfect beginnings. They're built from broken pieces, rebuilt slowly with steady hands and wide open hearts. Sometimes we think the most important parts of life are the grand moments, the victories, the triumphs, the easy wins. But the truth is, it's in the quiet rebuilding where the real magic happens. Robert and Ellie didn't find each other because they were perfect. They found each other because they chose to stay when it would have been easier to run. Because they dared to trust again, even with hearts stitched up from old wounds. Silver Hollow didn't survive because of luck. It survived because people, flawed, hurting, stubborn people, stood up for it when no one else would. Piece by piece, they stitched their lives back together. And so can we. No matter where you are in your journey, no matter what you've lost or how broken the road looks ahead, there's always a chance to start again, to rebuild, to choose love, to come home. If this story touched your heart, please consider liking, subscribing, and sharing it with someone who might need the reminder that it's never too late to find your place in the world. Here at Soul Stirring Stories, we believe in second chances, in love built from broken pieces, and in the quiet power of staying wherever you are tonight. Someone is waiting to ride home with you. Love